Good evening and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. Tonight I'm going to skip the math, I'm going to skip the measurement, I'm going to skip all the calculations, and I'm going to give you an overview of every volley. Sometimes I realize that I see this stuff day in and day out, and most folks don't. And so it's kind of it's a foreign world for many and kind of intimidating. So anyway, what I've been doing in the last day is putting together a reference book for both myself and other people. And that book consists of identifying the volleys, at a gross level, identifying their structure, their bullet count, etc., etc. And all that is derived from information that I glean from Sonic Visualizer. And so that's what I'm going to show you is these beautiful little graphs here that to some may seem meaningless, but when you look at them in a little bit closer detail, you start to see a wealth of information. And this can be seen by anybody who is even using Audacity, because this whitish background plot of the amplitude versus time is available to anybody with Audacity. But first let's go back and address a little bit different structure, and that will be the overall sequence of events that occurred from a more global perspective. So here we have a preliminary page that I'm working on that shows every gunshot event that occurred or theoretically should have occurred. And in it I give them names, and these are all pretty common. The first shots were the first 6 shots, then came volley 1, then we have this mythical thing called the shots at Campos down the hall, which no one has yet been able to verify. And then we get volley 2, 3, 4, and then we get the 6 308 shots. And then there's these odd things in the audio on many videos called the 6 booms, which sounds like somebody beating a drum at a regular pace for 6 beats. And then we have, the volley, which is that short 3-burst sequence, and then we have some actual down the hall shots as recorded by the Corey Langdon video that contain no supersonic cracks, so the bullets weren't coming out the window. And then we just continue on with volleys 6 through 12 and 2 single 308 shots at the end, and 1 shot which is up for grabs at the moment because I have neither verified it nor rejected it. But overall, that's the way the New York Times kind of laid things out, although they didn't talk about everything that's listed here. And I've kind of, early on I changed the numbering of the volleys, but I found it too cumbersome to talk with people, so I just adopted their account. And actually some of these volleys are further refined into little groups of bursts. The most notable is volley 5, which contains 3 short bursts of anywhere from 6 to 8 rounds each, separated over time. And volley 9, for example, has a short burst up front, a really long burst in the middle, and then a short burst at the end. And that's part of the structure or the composition of these volleys that will be showing in these pictures. Now I'm not going to be playing any sounds or anything like that, so it's just going to be straight pictures. Alright, so let's get to it. I'm going to start with this. And I'll explain this graph, this picture. This is just an image of this is actually just a screenshot of a partial piece of the Sonic Visualizer tool I use. And if you've listened to any of my videos before, this probably looks very familiar, with one exception. But let's start at the top. At the top I've got a plot here of what we call a proxy for power. And power, is the energy over time that was expended for each event. And that's where you see these peaks, or these little lines up and downs. And the brighter or more red the color on here, the greater the intensity of the sound. So, for example, these little ups and down spikes are the actual bullets going around, but prior to that, you can see this, that there's some sound here that's pretty loud at the lower end, and up at the top the sound isn't quite so loud. But you'll notice that not everything looks the same. That is, over here we see some up and down lines that are blurry, and in between we see some fade in and come back, and they're not evenly spaced, and then at the end it goes back to something else. So I look at that top part and I say, oh, okay. First off, I can see something happening. Second off, I can see it has a regular structure. Third off, I can see that it's not something which is entirely consistent amongst itself, i.e. it varies in volume, it varies in timing, and it varies by frequency. So this gives me a good first scoop on spotting it. This is a linear scale on the left, and of course all these graphs are linear in time from left to right. They're all on the same linear left to right scale. So what occurs in one graph occurs in the next graph at the exact same spot. Alright, the second graph here, the bluish one, is a log plot on the left, meaning that things at the bottom are emphasized and things at the top are compressed. So the bottom 1/3 of this plot here probably represents only the tiniest fraction of the entire frequency spectrum versus the remainder of it in the upper 2/3. And you do this because a lot of the action occurs at 1000 hertz and below, and that's what this emphasizes. The third thing is amplitude versus time, and this is something that many of you may have seen, and it's probably the first go-to thing. It's the thing that the New York Times used to align all the shots with, and it's a waveform plot. And it comes in very useful when you want to get right down to the nitty-gritty and identify exactly which wave caused what event. But what it doesn't tell you is any of this other stuff up here, because waves, there's multiple things going on all throughout this that are only readily apparent from these other graphs. And then when all is said and done, this is a graph that I've created by identifying every muzzle blast in this volley, and I mark it. I mark it in time, and then that's the points or the data that I use to further calculate almost everything. And I've done this for every volley, and I've done it for multiple videos, and I have a huge database of these things. So, well, we won't go into exactly what you see here, but that's the overall structure. And tonight we're just looking at the overall structure. What do we see? What don't we see? What would we expect? All this stuff. And I'll go into this volley in a minute. What I want to do is start with volley 1. Alright, here's volley 1. Now, if we start at the top, we can immediately see that the volley starts somewhere to the left over here, and this represents about the entire region from left of the screen to the right of the screen represents about 15 or 16 seconds. So as you can see here, the volley itself is on the order of 10 or more seconds. The second thing you'll see, at least that I see down here from the plot, the amplitude plot, is that not all signals are the same. For example, in the region, let me go ahead and get up a pencil here to color with, and I like green tonight. So you see here that there's a lot of white space, meaning that the signal was low amplitude. Now remember, this is volley 1. So what was happening in the background was somebody singing, drum beats, all that, and that's these yellow noises, and you'll see that there's a lot of energy associated with that continued throughout nearly all the volley. Here you can see some probably bass drums or something, but you lose the vocals. and other instrumentals here. So at some point near the end of this first volley, things kind of, on stage anyway, started to get kind of quiet. And then over here you'll see that there's very little anything going on, neither gunshots nor singing and all that, until these big orangish spots turned up, and that's probably when people started getting the idea that they were being shot at and shit hit the fan. But anyway, back to the amplitude plot, you'll see that not all the signals are the same. And then you'll see that some signals have structure down here at the low end. I wanted red. Well, let's just plot this for a moment. Draw on it. We'll see that, we draw lines connecting these things. It kind of gives us an indication of what's going on at some point. And you can see it's not a straight line, and that represents the intensities of these various sounds. The other thing you'll see is that these are pretty regularly spaced. In fact, if we go down here and look at my representation of where the muzzle blast occurred, you'd be hard-pressed to say that wasn't a machine gun. It's not, but you'd be hard-pressed to say it wasn't. So all these shots or rounds occurred at on a very regularly spaced thing. The next thing that some of you might notice is that let's use light blue. Is that there's a bunch of spikes here, but the first muzzle blast occurred over here, and that region there is the lag. It's the time difference between, actually, in that blue line's a little bit short, a little bit long. It should have started right about here. Yeah. So we had these supersonic cracks come in about 1, 2, 3 of them, 3 or 4 before we even hear the first muzzle blast. Now that's not 2 guns, that's 1 gun, and because the bullets fly faster, you hear the sound from them sooner, leastways for this recording location, which I haven't identified, and then you hear the muzzle blast sometime later. And similarly on the other end, if we look, we can see that the muzzles are in there, but we don't get a real good idea from this graph where the last supersonic crack is, because the supersonic cracks come and go in intensity. For example, over here is a loud version of supersonic cracks. Here's some intermittent ones you can probably readily pick up, and then it's kind of low here, and then it picks back up again for this region, and then they drop off, and they're there. You can see the structure of them, but it's just very faint. And then this loud noises of singing or people, I don't know which, without listening to the actual audio or getting closer down to the details, overrides the intensity of the supersonic crack until there we can see one right there, maybe a couple there, but I can't really make them out over there, so I can't determine the lag from the tail end. Theoretically, it would probably be like this, because normally the front end and the tail end are kind of symmetrical. That is, if we draw the lag, we see that it goes like that on the left, and then on the top end it'll be the same thing, only in reverse, in that we'll have the muzzle blast still going after the last supersonic crack right in here probably has finished. And so you get this separation in time between the supersonic cracks and the muzzle. So in this case we'll probably have on the order of 100 muzzle blasts, and correspondingly there would be 100 supersonic cracks, even though not all of them are audible above the intensity of the muzzle in this case, which we can see if let's mark with a different color, that the muzzle blasts are pretty consistent going all the way across, even though they do get a little bit louder in other spaces. So overall, And up on the top, this is the range in which the muzzle blasts occur, or that's the top end. Then of course, let's go to yellow. Can't see things too good there. This is the top end of the muzzle blasts energies, and then the top end for the supersonics, which are very visible, is here, here, and here. But in between there, you can still see the structure of the supersonic cracks. They're just not going to be real loud. Okay. And then over here, towards the end, this region, you can barely see any supersonic crack structure whatsoever. And that's due to the fact that since this is probably a stationary recording, this is due to the fact that the bullets are taking a different route. And this route is substantially, it's further away from the recording location than these over here. These bullets up front, came pretty close. What's that? Closer to the recording than these over there. These on the left came closer than those in the middle. Okay. So we have the measurements for the muzzle blast down here. Okay, we have the amplitude plot, which can reveal, details in here. Now, one thing to look at on this graph is that from at least I can't, from this plot of amplitude, it's extremely hard to tell whether that's, whether, that line is a muzzle blast or whether that line is a muzzle blast, or vice versa, which one is a supersonic crack. Now, if I were to, be in Sonic Visualizer and expand it out down to, 16 individual sampling points, I could probably tell you, because typically the muzzle blast is about 3 times longer in duration than a supersonic crack. But this is the structure of Volley 1. And it would be heard as, louder than the music, although in certain regions here not quite as loud as in other times, because the music came up in intensity and then went down. It would be, these gunshots sometimes would be noticeable, particularly up front where you have these first few supersonic cracks, and through this region where you have pretty strong muzzle blast. Over here, not so much. You might get confused as to it just being part of the performance. Okay, that's Volley 1. So let's clear the screen, and now let's move on to Volley 2, and then I'm going to go back to the first shots. But let's do Volley 2 first, because it's a completely different looking picture. All right. So here we are. Now, in this case, you'll notice that there are, in terms of the energy plot up here, while it comes and goes and it's loud at the front and loud over here towards the right, it doesn't just drop off the face of the earth like the first one did. It gradually fades out and comes back in, then it gets strong. Might have missed one or two there. And then this region is kind of weak, but then it picks back up again, and then it gets weaker and stronger. In this case, they're closer together. This little region, the bullets are coming closer together from the auditory perspective. We don't really know, but we have to look down here. In this graph, we could see the actual timing of the rounds, and you'll notice that there's a big gap here, and over here is a couple pretty good sized graphs. And we expect to see that reflected in the energies above. And up here, indeed, we see roughly at the same time that gap, and we see it roughly there as that. If we look real close in this frequency on the second graph, the bluish one, we can actually see that the supersonic cracks end about there. The muzzle blast are still doing, because there's a little bit of lag, and it comes out there and then they come down. So we see this step function all the time. Correspondingly, at the head of that start of that volley, we have supersonic cracks, and then we get muzzles, And this length and this length are typically about the same, unless the gun has moved, the barrel of the gun is moving substantially, which it could very well be. And then after this gap, again we see this gap of muzzle blast. Remember, we see this little pattern, and then again on the tail end we should see something similar. But once again, I can't. It looks as though some of the supersonic cracks may have faded out early, but because right now it just kind of looks like this. That's what I see off first blast. I'd have to go into Sonic Visualizer and amplify it. It's probably not that case, because that would represent an unreasonably large lag. So in reality, it's probably more like this. All right. Now, if we clear that, so can I do it just by doing that? Yeah. We can see the relative intensity of the supersonic crack to the muzzle is different than Volley 1. In Volley 1 we had pretty consistent along the muzzle, which is right here below that red line, and the supersonic crack faded in and out a lot more heavily. Here, since it's divided right about here, we can see that there's some pretty intense supersonic cracks here. Well, let's just mark them here, there, all the way over to there, right through there. In fact, this region, is pretty consistently loud. And yet down here in the bottom, where these muzzle blasts are, we see that there's some fading going on there. Maybe actually all the way over to there. This gap, which we identified as being the same as that gap up there, roughly speaking. That is, there were no bullets being fired at that time. But over here we see a softer region, and here's kind of a little bit of a softer region corresponding to those gaps down there. So in this recording, what you hear will actually be a mixture between the supersonic cracks and the muzzle blast, and who dominates varies back and forth. Okay, now something I didn't cover yet is it's a little fun. You can see here, this is Volley 2, and by now people are screaming and hollering and running, and well, maybe not running so much. The noise on the left here is the cacophony of all the people screaming, and then you'll notice that it just stops. Well, in reality, it doesn't stop completely, but what happens is the sound of the supersonic cracks is so loud that the camera adjusts the automatic gain to capture them, and in so doing reduces the intensity of this down to these little, blobs of yellow here you see all the way along. So that's an artifact. This region is an artifact of the automatic gain control. And similarly, after the volley is done, you'll see the automatic gain circuitry ramping the gain back up to pick up these sounds, and that's when you can again see the vocalizations. And that's the automatic gain circuitry, and it's constantly doing that. For example, here in the gap there, you can actually see a little bit of it too, where it's trying to adjust that. You can see a little bit of it here where it's trying to adjust that. Alright. Other significant points here. In these muzzle blasts along here, you'll see these really intense regions. Now, none of the muzzle blasts elsewhere are doing that kind of intensity. So you immediately ask, what might those be? And similarly, you might ask the same question of this over there. So we jump up to the energy up here, and we see that, we got a few lines that are smeared here, and we got a few lines that are smeared there, so maybe they're somehow a related phenomena. What I found is when I look at the plot of the amplitude down here, we see that these signals, if you take just one of them, are starting to get pretty wide, that this portion of the signal is really quite wide compared to this fine line. And when you have a wide signal, that's not an indication of a gunshot, i.e. the muzzle blast or the supersonic crack, but it's very likely an indication of a strike. That is, these bullets in there hit something. Now there's a couple other different phenomena. It could be people stomping or beating things, or an unusually loud echo that comes in right at the same time and causes the muzzle blast to just, be unusually loud. But on average, these high intensity blobs, particularly since they're fairly wide, tend to indicate a strike of some sort. So this may well be a region that you would want to look at closely to see if either people or objects were hit. And the lower the frequency, the larger the object. So if there were lots and lots of energy in these higher frequencies, then you could start to say it was a harder surface, let's say. But if it's just dominated like these are right here, that's probably a larger, softer body. Okay. Let's see, anything else on Volley 2? No, that's Volley 2. Again, I want you to observe the overall structure. Because once you realize the overall structure and what the parts of the structure are, then you can quickly ascertain for yourself that there's not two guns, there's not talking guns, and all this other stuff. That, what the sounds actually sound like when you're there is it sounds like multiple guns at the same time, but it's not. It's just the way the phenomena of the acoustics of the gunshot sounds themselves, because they're being produced. The sounds are being produced by two sources: the muzzle and the bullet traveling through the air, and the traveling bullet is producing sounds constantly. Okay. And for overall structure of the weight of the volley itself, I always rely upon these markings down here that I've created where every muzzle blast occurs. And I can use these in a pattern recognition algorithm because these are accurate typically down to about a 1 millisecond range, or maybe even less. And I can take these, and if you give me 5 segments of, or 5 muzzle blasts from any particular volley, and you've measured it accurately, I can compare those against all the volleys I have and tell you which portion of which volley it came from. Alright, Volley 2. Now let's move on back up to the first 6 shots. Now that we have a little bit of experience under our belt and what these things look like and tend to reveal, let's go back up and look at the first 6 shots, because they don't have the nice structure that these larger volleys do. Okay. Now, on this one, the first thing we see is that there's some big spikes in through here. And actually, there's a bunch of spikes everywhere, but there are more prominent ones here, and I'm going to mark them out for us. There's, oops. There's one there, one there, one there, one there, and one there. That one's a little funny looking. And then there's 2 over here. Alright. So, we have to determine what all these are. And right off the top, for this recording, I would eliminate this fuzzy one. So let's just go ahead and eliminate it, because just from this recording at this level, that looks a little weird to be counted as a gunshot, even though ultimately I know it is because I've looked at several different videos. And this one, while it's sharp, it's spotty, and so I would just, off the top of my head, classify that as a strong reflection of this first event. And so I would come up on first blush with 5 significant events based upon the energy pattern. And then I would look down into a little bit lower frequency on there, because the spikes for the higher frequency ones stand out real clear, and we see that we got something. Well, let's mark those with a different color. Let's mark them with yellow. So we have something here, maybe something there, a little bit of something there, don't know, maybe something there, and I would call that an echo, something there weird looking, maybe something here. Okay, and that's on the energy level. And then I would come down to the frequency plot and look into the region where the muzzle blast would normally occur, and I would say, and in this case we got a yellow will show up. I would say we got something here, here, here. Oh goodness, what do we have here? It looks like that's hard to make out. Certainly something there and maybe something there, and then way over here, nothing so clear. And let's turn those to green so that we can see them on that color scheme better. Nope, that doesn't work either. Let's turn them to black. That's right, black might work. Yeah, okay. Something there, 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 and probably here and here, and then over there I said I couldn't do anything. Alright, so we've got, let's make this bigger, I guess. One, that's not good. Let's go with that one. Let's go with one event there, one event there, one event here, two events here, and then no definitive events over here. So now we start to see a picture forming, and we see that we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 muzzle blasts in this region where there are 4 shots. So that would mean that there's another shot up here, the supersonic crack that is, that we're missing. And over here we don't have corresponding muzzle blast because it's hidden by some other noise at this scale and level of intensity. Alright, so now when we go down to the waveform plot, we have, let's see, we got, I'll just mark them. We've got that, we got this, we got that, we got this, we got that, we got this, we've got, hard to say here, at least that, maybe something else there, and over here it's all mixed up, and there actually looks like there's other stuff over there, but so, and we got the sound being ramped up that way, and over here it's a real quick ramp down like that. Okay, so now what does all this tell us? Well, it helps us identify where the individual supersonic cracks are and the individual muzzle blasts are. And I've done a great deal of research on this and detailed analysis, and I've identified the muzzle blast here, well, everywhere there's a line. 6 of them. And so, you know, we have the first shot and then a ways, and this whole region is about 8 seconds. So we got the first one, then we got a gap a little bit, and then we've got two quick in a row rounds, and then we got 3 more evenly spaced for a grand total of 6. And the music or whatever is kind of, you know, doing this ramp up at this region. And it doesn't look like this is an automatic gain circuitry because of the bullets. It might be automatic gain circuitry adjusting the volume because of the music, but the music's, with all this, you know, large intense yellow stuff here, is certainly the more dominant sound, with the exception of this region. And that's why we see the signals down here more prominently, is because in this case the backgrounds, well, I'll call it foreground or background, the music was more dominant than the gunshots were. So in this case I would say that the gunshot sounds during this region of time were not as loud as the music for most of the cases, with the exception of this region. So Once again, the takeaway is here that you can listen and you can detect these things, and you could actually detect sometimes a gunshot amongst all the noise that is really hard to see on any of these plots without some filtering. But for the most part, it's easier to spot these quick incursions of energy into an otherwise different stream of sound. And that's why I use Sonic Visualizer. And that's why if you're limited strictly to this waveform plot as your only tool, with, of course, listening, then you can miss some things. And besides, I like the pretty colors. I've chosen the color schemes here. Alright, so we've covered the first 6 shots. We've covered volleys 1. We've covered volley 2. Let's go on to volley 3. Volley 1, volley 2. Oh, and remember, theoretically in there somewhere after volley 1 was the shots down the hallway at Campos before Shuck had arrived. Okay, now this is volley 2. Here we are, volley 3. Yep. Okay. And see, this presents in a slightly different fashion than any of the other two did. First off, you'll notice, things that just jump out at me are first off, there's quite a bit of irregularity on the bottom here. There's quite a bit of irregularity in the timing of the rounds. Versus volley 1, which was near perfect in terms of timing. Volley 2, which had a couple of gaps, but this one's got little gaps everywhere. And there's even some real close rounds here. The first portion of it is a little bit more regular than the remainder of it. Okay, if we look at the overall amplitude from the well, let's first identify where everything is at. We see a big grouping here, and then we see what looks to be a little bit of stuff happening there, and we can confirm that with the muzzle blast by dropping down into the frequency plot, and we observe regular structure there, and then we observe certainly a lot of regular structure there. That's the supersonic crack. And then we see some structure down there. Okay, if we were to look at and map the amplitude in the regions of interest, we would see, wow, that's a poor color. We would see, this, and then all of a sudden it would be this. Okay. So the amplitude for any of the regions varies pretty substantially, but based upon both the top plot and the second one, the supersonic cracks are going to dominate this region of the volley. But over here, in the first burst, I call it, of this, probably not going to hear any supersonic cracks. It's all going to be muzzle, and even that's going to be low. So, and we can see that by looking at this region here. This is once again the background sound of all the people talking all merged together, and it's coming in right here, and it continues on even while the first portion of this volley is occurring, meaning that relative to the people screaming, the first 12 or so shots of this volley aren't very audible whatsoever. Okay, but just like the other things, you'll see these big bright yellow things, and those are likely to be strikes on something. Since there's very little energy in the upper portions, again, these are probably to be likely to be strikes on wood or a water-based thing. I'd have to look at them each individually to ascertain what they are. So what other observations can we make? It looks like yeah, that's about it. Not much automatic gain control going on here, although once again you see that there is some change there. Whether it's automatic gain control or not, I don't know. That could simply be quiet time, so to speak, that while this volley's going, everybody kind of hunkered down and shut up, and it took them a few seconds before they got up and started running or talking. I don't know. I'd have to look at that more carefully. That's volley 3. So now we've progressed to a volley that's irregular. It's consistently, well, actually it has 2 parts. The first one part, which is entirely different than the remainder, and that the intensity and the regularity are much different, although the regularity of this portion looks a lot like the regularity of that. Okay, that's volley 3. So now we're coming up on the last volley before the big gap. Volley 4. Okay. Yeah, you know, every volley's different. In fact, this is I can tell immediately this is a different recording, because, you know, each video has its own unique characteristics, and I can tell from the fact of the background sounds and everything that this is a little bit different recording. So let's look at this. This is volley 4. What do we want to look at first? Well, you normally don't have the bottom part. We just normally have these 3 top parts. But if we look at the overall intensity of the sounds, we can see that there's, you know, lower intensity. Whoa, back up there. Don't think I need that big a thing. You know, the first thing that's apparent here is the is the lag step, I call it, and it's pretty even. So, you know, you have the supersonic cracks come in, then the volleys. Then the muzzle, and then at the end the supersonic cracks in while the muzzle continues. Yeah. And actually, let's stop for a moment and ask ourselves a question. When does this round start? Well, to the people on the ground, it starts when they hear the first sound, which would be over here. And it would end right there. But that means that we actually have a longer series of sounds than what the rounds are doing at the shooter. That is, at the shooter, you know, there's pretty much, like in the Corey Langdon video, everything starts and stops in the same spot, because there's almost zero lag at the shooters. Okay. All right. So back to the analysis. Now, in this case, we see a very prominent and very dominant energy in these lower regions, and so compared to up here in the supersonic cracked, and you can see that too up in the top plot, where the energy in the muzzle blast is pretty intense in color versus the energy associated with the supersonic crack in the upper regions. And that's confirmed and verified down here. And while those supersonic cracks seem to be squeaking in between muzzle rounds because of the shift in alignment, those supersonic cracks just aren't cutting it compared to the dominant muzzles down here. So this is going to sound more boomish than cracky, even though both sounds are present. What else can we say about this? Well, you know, it only has one region that's kind of gappy, and the other's pretty regular. This is a a much quicker rate of fire than this over here. And what's interesting to me, though, is how these, we call them sawtooth waves, because they look like the edge of a saw, on a hand saw. If you look at the teeth real close, they're jagged. This is saw, and yet this is flat, which means that something different was happening with the shooter here than to the left. This is, the intensity is varying, or it could be happening with the camera. If this is a phenomena of the shooter, then the gun is oscillating back and forth a little bit. If it's a phenomena of the recording, then somebody's blocking the camera, or the camera is rotating. And you can't really distinguish the two always, except that the lag would vary up here. And I would have to expand this out by a factor of 10 and associate every sonic event with every muzzle event and calculate the lag there, which I can't do from this graph. It's just too compressed. Alright, so what can we say about this volley, which is, once again, volley 4? Well, it's a lot more regular than volley 3. So if there was any fatigue involved, you'd expect it to be more erratic. And in fact, it looks like that the gun being used has a higher rate of fire than, let's go back up to the previous one, than this one, because you see the gaps between everything is much wider up here than here. So most definitely a different scenario, a different gun, a different triggering device, perhaps a different person, or something else. So you never can really positively say what the cause is without having additional information. All you can do is observe is that the rate of fire was much higher here than even over there, and then much higher than the previous ones. Overall, based upon the intensity, let's make a careful analysis of the intensity of the muzzle blast and the intensity of the supersonic crack. The intensity of the supersonic crack will be the thing. You see that the intensity is wavering. Whereas over here, it's pretty evenly with a little bump there, a little bump there and there. Now, does that correspond exactly with the sawtooth phenomena? Let's see. Sawtooth starts there and ends there. Kinda. Sawtooth starts there and not as much. Okay, well, what about the intensity of the muzzles? Well, that just sort of was on a gradual increase with this one little hump there. But on the bottom end of it, you had kind of a there. And on the left-hand side, you had pretty stable with a big jump there. So once again, you don't know if it's a phenomena of the gun or a phenomena of the recording. We'll have to go and look in depth and everything. But we do see the same lag step as other rounds. Where now I know from just looking at the lag that this recording was in the venue, because the lag starts to get, in fact over here it's looking like about 0.3 seconds, which if I were to expand this out in sonic, you'll see how many we got. About 1, 2, 3, 3.5, almost 4 muzzles coming after the last supersonic crack. So that's about 4/10 of a second, because these are somewhere on the order of 1/10 of a second. So 4/10 of a second, high 3/10 at least, indicates that the bullets were going fairly close to that position they're not hitting them because you don't just see the complete dominance of these things, but it is yellow. But it has to be yellow down below also to indicate hits. So these were just pretty loud muzzles, and that means that the gun is pointing fairly consistently all along in this region. Certainly a little variation there, but then once again we wrap back up into pointing exactly with the user. So that's volley, and of course then we have these slightly large things here with an increased density there, gradually going out. So I would say, just off the top of my head, that this sawtooth business is not associated with the rifle itself, but more, I don't know, this region kind of all leads me to be a barrel phenomena, but these over here lead me to believe it's a recording phenomena. Well, another time, another dollar. So that was volley 4. Now we come into the region where we had single shots. There was that big long 2-minute gap where for the first minute between volley 4 and then the short 3 bursts volley 5, where the only thing that was happening gunpoint wise were 6 in single shots, which theoretically came from a larger caliber. And so let's go. That's what we're going to see up next. He says confidently, yeah, single shots between volleys 4 and 5. Now, this picture actually covers a little bit more, and it's not the same scale because this covers at least a minute and a half in time. And what I want to bring your attention to, when you first look at this, and this may not be the scale that you look on things with when you're in Sonic Visualizer, but you're going to notice, first you're going to notice these kind of things that peek out above the whole group and are kind of spiky. And then if you come down to the amplitude graph, you'll see again, these things that are easy to identify really, because they're just all above the thing. And then that one, which is different but similar. Okay, so right off the top of your head, looking at the amplitude and the frequency plots, you can quickly identify 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now when we get into the energy thing up here, it looks like total random chaos. I mean, look at all these lines over here to the right. I mean, we're just filled with lines and lines and lines and lines, and you start to go, what the heck is happening? Looks like somebody was constantly firing. And we'll leave it at that for the moment. But we do see some indications of stuff happening, but yet it doesn't always line up with what the second and third plots say. And this is the real nature of acoustic gunshot analysis, is you can never decide from just one type of observation what's really going on, because individual gunshot sounds mixed amongst a whole bunch of other stuff without multiple rounds following them are difficult. And so you end up spending a lot of time looking around the shot that you think is a gunshot, and you'll have to look at the frequencies, the width, the timing, the whole 9 yards. Now when you play it, your ear picks up pretty well. In this case, all these shots are going to be quite audible to the ear, because they're just in amplitude, they're just so far above the signal. But in many cases, that's not the case. The other thing that we notice here is that where are the muzzle blasts? I mean, in all the other cases, the muzzle blasts were right there and dominant and present and clearly visible. So we start to see, now that these shots don't look the same as the prior shots. In fact, they don't even look the same as the ones we'll see a little bit to the right over here, which are volleys, the 3 short burst volleys. And even those are hard to make out, but up here you can see them a little bit better because they fuzzy up the region. This is a large scale, so all the shots are close together there. And then of course you can kind of see the structure there. You can kind of see a structure here and there. And that's how you would identify them, and that's how I have them marked. But then also you got this weirdness going on right here. And there's 6 massive low frequency spikes. And so they look like what happens when you have a bullet hit a soft body, don't they? Yes, they do. And that's in fact what they sound like. 6, but when you listen to them, and because of the width of them and the deep yellowness of them, they're too loud to be a hit or a strike. And the exact nature and cause of these I'm not completely confident in yet. But these are heard over throughout a large region of the venue, and they appear to get closer the closer you get to the stage. And I preliminary said then that might be somebody, either beating the microphone on something, or footsteps on the stage or near or around it being picked up by the microphone. Alright, so but back to the single shots. So at this point in time, you would look at this and say, we've got a different weapon and maybe even a different caliber. Now normally you'd expect that the larger the caliber, the bigger the boom, the larger the caliber. So if somebody come along and said, well, these look like 308 shots, and you'd go, well, then why are these 223 rounds over here so much more brilliant, both on the upper end and the lower end, on the supersonic crack and the muzzle retort? And you'd have to start scratching your head and going, and that's where you would have to make multiple observations. In fact, it ended up taking me about 20 different videos before I got the real picture of what's going on. These shots, which may well indeed be 308 shots, are attenuated substantially. They're not run through a suppressor because you can still see them. If they were run through a suppressor, you wouldn't be able to see them. And they're not subsonic, they're supersonic, because you can see these are almost exclusively supersonic cracks that we're seeing. And so then you come up and you say, well, what happened to the muzzle blast? So first off, you have the muzzle blast is attenuated way off the scale, and you have the supersonic crack attenuated out of proportion to what you would expect. And so that indicates that these shots came from a location which was partially undercover. That is, if you have to express it in terms of what the LVMPD is telling us, is that these shots would had to have come from at least 10 to 12 feet inside of room 134. But I can't conclusively prove that with this graph for sure. Now, after looking at a lot more graphs and expanding this thing way out and applying several different types of analysis, I've marked on the bottom where I think points of interest are. And that includes more than just muzzle. And the muzzles probably are closer to these right regions than they are to these first ones, who are probably supersonic cracks. So here's a supersonic crack without a corresponding muzzle. This is probably a supersonic crack, and that's the muzzle retort. Here I have marked supersonic crack in a couple different locations for the muzzle. And similarly here, I don't know what I've done there. I'd have to expand it out on Sonic Visualizer. Okay, so that's the region between volleys 4 and volley 5, and actually these are volley 5. There's 3 bursts there, and we're going to get into that next. Okay, but anyway, these single shots are some of the most difficult things to identify, because after all, if you've got 50 rounds going off all near one another in a close time frame, they all can kind of look pretty similar. All right, on to volley 5. Or did I leave that? You just expressed it there. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Volleys 5 and the 6 booms. Okay, now we're back to the normal scale of 16, roughly 15 or 16 seconds. So this is an enlarged version of this region to the right. And we can see more of the finer structure of the whole thing. So this is volley 5. Volley 5 consists of 3 individual bursts, each of no more than 8 to 13 shots. Alright. So, with this, now we can start looking at things. Now, just like everything else, we can see a good, strong, solid supersonic crack and a good, strong muzzle for that burst. Not so strong here on either the muzzle or the supersonic, and somewhere in between on these. But they're quickly and readily identified as being gunshots just from that graph alone, although you would begin to wonder about this. But so you look down below and you see, oh, we've got these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that are kind of wide, they're kind of strong, they're in the low frequency range with no corresponding crack up here on the top. They can't be gunshots unless the supersonic crack is missing, but because they're so intense, it's unlikely that the supersonic crack would be missing unless they were just some big pistol shot or something. But even these are way too wide for a pistol shot. Even a pistol shot is much, much more narrow than that. A pistol shot is more like this in width. So anyway, in the frequency plot, we can see that there's, the supersonic crack that were present, more so here than anywhere. And the muzzles are pretty there and pretty intense. Once again, on the third one, they're very clear and distinct, and they're also starting to get very, very bright. This may represent a hit there. It's not clear because all the muzzles are bright. Okay. And I've marked them down below. We have 6 booms. And in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 shots there. 6 here. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 shots there. From the amplitude, you can see that the amplitude for this burst were all the same. For these, it was kind of like that, and for these, they were all the same. So the greatest variety there came from there. All these volleys are about the same cyclic rate of fire. There's not much variation in them at all. That's volley 5 with the 6 booms that precede it. Alright. So on to the next one. But you can see the structure that I see in these things. It's not just a sound that I hear, it's the overall structure. And if you'll notice here, we still have the lag step bigger on this one than the first two. So this shot was closer. Oh, where's the first one? Oh, over there. Oh, wait a minute. Now here we go. Okay, so they're pretty symmetrical for each one. The third one has the greatest lag, so it's the closest to the recording device. Unless, something strange was going on with the recording where they were pumping, jumping in behind a wall or something, because that too can affect the sound. Okay, but you see that even at this scale, there's all these other little things going on that you might think are gunshots, and in many cases they do in fact look like gunshots, but when you get down to looking at them very, very close, they fail on several points. Alright, That's volley 5. Let's move on to 6. Got a few to cover yet. Alright. Oops, nope, this is not 6. This is down the hall shots. This was taken from, and you can see that these colors down here changed. That's how I know I'm changing recordings. These are down the hall shots as recorded from the Corey Langdon video. And the first thing you'll notice is nothing's bright, except for these things, which is the ladies somebody talking. There's no supersonic cracks. Nothing up here in the high frequency. Nothing here in the high frequency. No big spikes. All we have are these little bitty things, which are just above the noise level. So, and then over here where they're talking, that's even more difficult to dig out. So this one was a hard one to dig out. It took me quite a number of hours to finally come up with these timings down there. So these could be off a little bit, but over here it was pretty clear. So this is down the hall shots. No supersonic crack means no bullet went by that recording location. And for all other videos, all other videos for all the volleys, the big volleys that evening, we have supersonic cracks. So in this case, we can say that the gun was not pointed in the direction of the venue, that if it had been a suppressed gun, you would have lost the muzzle blast, which you don't, and you would have saw the supersonic crack potentially, if you don't, but you don't. If they'd used subsonic rounds, you would have heard neither typically, although you may have heard the bullet go by at a reduced volume, and that they're just way soft. In fact, some people, when we first heard this, thought they were just, a little bit of echoes of something, until we got all the timing straightened out. Okay, so that's down the hall shots. Even here, though, they're clearly identifiable. So the next one should be volley 6. And again, why didn't that fill the screen? I don't know. Did volley 7 fill the screen? 7 fill the screen. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't make that slide very well. But anyway, now we're back to our typical scenario. And unfortunately it captured some of that up there, so I can't look at the lag on that. Alright. What do we see? Well, we see that there's a lot of sound here. In almost all the rounds, we see a strong sonic crack for the entire sequence. And we see a strong muzzle. Oops, I shouldn't have marked. Let me go back, and that's misleading. Strong muzzle. There we go. The same is true over here. I mismarked the muzzle, because it should not have. Not hit erase. The muzzle really starts somewhere in there like that. Okay, and you can see that in the amplitude. You can see it in the frequency, and you can see it in the energy plots. If you wanted to identify the lag step, you can see it's pretty regular. Same as over here, maybe a little bit larger. Okay. Now, in terms of looking at these amplitude plot, it's damn near impossible to identify the lag step, but we can see it in this case because there's these overlapping signals where they go from just one to multiple. Same here. and same there. Okay, so this is and if you look at the spacing across the shots, it's very, except for this little gap there and the little gap there, it's a very regular it's a very regular volley, even though it comes in 2 bursts. And the overall structure, that's what I wanted to show you, is that this is volley 6, but it consists of 2 independent bursts, one short and then the second one long. They're both very similar, and they would present to the ear. You'll hear both the volleys and the supersonic crack. Sometimes they'll appear as one sound, because as this timing shifts across there, sometimes they line up. Like right here, this is probably lining up as one sound, even though this muzzle was for this supersonic crack. So you're probably going to hear both sounds individually, sometimes not, and it's going to be a very present feeling. It'll be louder in this location for this volley than other volleys, because the sounds are just right there. Okay, otherwise there's nothing particularly significant about this volley for this recording location that I see on first blush. Alright, so now let's go to volley 7. Well, now ain't that something different? Got something to talk about here. Well, first off, you see up here that the supersonic crack was only really loud and present for a very short region in the middle of the volley. And overall, compared to this very uniform muzzle sounds, very loud, very present, very consistent, as you can see from the amplitude plot here. And then in the middle, you see these extra noises come in, which are the supersonic crack. Now, this is probably one of the most frustrating volleys that there is, that leads people to believe that there were multiple guns. But if you look closely, even in this fairly large perspective plot, you'll see that we have all these fine little structures here, all these little lines. Okay, and you then start to say, well, what is that? Are those the muzzles, or is that the supersonic crack? And you can't really answer that question from that plot alone, but if you drop down to the frequency one, you can. See, the muzzle comes right along here, and that's the upper limit of the muzzle frequencies. So it can't be muzzle. So you see all these little lines. Those are the supersonic cracks. They're just so soft that you can't hear them. But we can see them in this plot. And so, when people hear the sound, they hear this type sound. Now in this case, the tick tick ticks are probably more like tick 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 tick, and on top of it you'll hear the muzzle boom 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 boom. So it's going to sound like a second gun further off firing a bullet somehow without a muzzle blast sound, but it's not. This is one gun firing, I don't know, 95 or 100 rounds, and all these sounds are produced by those rounds, not by another gun. And you can say, Richard, where's the lag? That's a good question, because there's not much lag associated either the head. We don't see that normal step, do we? Maybe just one bullet, maybe just one bullet, maybe not. So what's that mean? Different gun, different location? No. Well, it could be a different gun, I don't know. But what it indicates is that for this region and this region marked in yellow, that the gun was pointed away from the recording location. For this region, the gun was pointed closer to the recording location. So that means that this is a sweeping gun. Now I can't tell you from this one plot alone which way it swept, but it got close to this recording location there. I know from the color of this down here that this recording location is close to the center of the stage and close to the stage itself. So I can say that this gun swept, whether it was far away or whether it was coming closer or moving away is really hard to tell here. So it was either, I'll just put two arrows, moving close to or away from, moving close to or away from here. And you say, how can that drop off in one round occur so quickly? Well, it doesn't. It's just that the amplitude on this plot is not conducive to locating the little finer details of structure in there. There is, the slight ramp coming down on both sides, and you can barely see it here because you can see the little bitty fine structure there. So it took more time here. It took probably like that, but over here it came down pretty quickly. So it didn't occur just in one shot. It occurred in 2 or 3 or 4 shots. It was moving pretty quick. But that's Volley 7, the talking guns, and I just explained why it's not multiple guns, but one gun, which was not pointed towards the recording location except in the middle of the volley. So somewhere there are other recordings where this volley, was brilliant compared to, or that not brilliant, but closer to the recording location for these regions and not there. And I think actually if you look at the Raymond Page one, you can see a much finer detail on everything because the supersonic shots are more like that than this big peak. But for anything south of, say, the Western VIP thing, you'll probably see something like this. And north of the VIP west, you'll probably see a more even distribution with the weakening in the center, i.e. the complement of this. Okay, that's Volley 7. Yeah, we've got a couple more to do. This is true. Let's go to 8. We're going to start, making them brief because we covered a lot of stuff already. All right. Oh no, that was it. Wait a minute. Where's 8? This is not 8. This is 9. He said. They say, how do you know? Did I call it Volley 8? No. Where'd Volley 8 go? That was 7. Well, I ignored Volley 8, so we won't cover it tonight. We got plenty of material here. I'll include it in the real final report. Volley 8 consists of 2 volleys. Let's see, a long one covering probably about 85, 90 shots, and then a short one covering, 10 or 15 shots. This is Volley 9. And Volley 9 is one of my favorites because it's so unique in terms of its pattern. And here at the top, we see this final burst, a middle burst, and then this burst over here, although it's a little bit weak, very weak, and different. Okay, so we have 2 bursts, the second and the third part of this volley, which look very similar. We have the muzzle energy being pretty good. We have the supersonic crack up here being pretty good, but a little variation. Over here, though, on the left, on the first volley, we've got very little supersonic crack and very little muzzle. And if we come down and we look at the frequency plot, again we see the step lag there and here. Much harder to see here, but it is there. Can't really see it there at this scale. Okay, so on the frequency plot we see that these supersonic cracks were just about as equal in intensity to the muzzles there. The muzzle intensity was, fairly consistent, flat on the second one. And you can see that by looking at these lower regions also. So it's flat here, flat there. So for both the second burst and the third burst, you have a pretty consistent picture. The variation in timing was not too bad. You got two gaps, except for now this first part. So for the second and third bursts of this, you're going to have, in this case, a louder muzzle than you are a supersonic crack, but you're going to hear both of them. And in the first part of the middle burst, the supersonic crack is going to dominate, particularly until the muzzles come along after the lag region. But on the first half of this, it's a whole different game. Here, the whole burst is no supersonic crack, reduced in intensity, because it is there, as you can see by the finer structures up here in the top plot. And you could probably hear the muzzle, but you probably can barely make out the supersonic crack portion. And once again, one gun, just with this lag thing going on. And let's at the amplitude plot. We see, everything's pretty consistent with the upper two plots, except that here we see these loud peaks. They should be loud peaks. That's not up there. So to me that would indicate that something happened at the camera level for this first portion, or this first burst of Volley 9, that changed the angle of the presentation of the sounds to the camera. That would be my first guess. Alright, let's move on to Volley 10. Volley 10. Okay. Well, Volley 10 has a lot going on, doesn't it? Volley 10. First thing, we notice that this background noise over here starts to become really intense compared to the sounds of the gunshots themselves. And we see this pretty low region of sound there. We see at the start, we see the lag, not quite that big, Richard. That big. So that's the lag region. The lag region over here. So this again is part of that by the stage one where the lag is large. In the frequency plot, we see this dip at the top end, kind of straight across there and kind of straight across there, which kind of goes along with that. Okay. We see the muzzle retort energy flat there and then drop off dramatically here and come back in. And down here on the frequency we see it got a little bit bigger there, but a pretty across the board frequency spread on the muzzle. On the supersonic, actually it came in there, I was wrong, came in there a little bit. Okay. We see, on the amplitude one is almost useless in this case. You really have to go to a frequency plot to see the structure. So what do we see? We see a high density region of shots there. So this is the round. You can see from the spacing that was all over the map. It was going fast, it was going slow, sounded like it was dying out towards the end. These are almost twice the width, not twice the width, but 50% greater in width than these high density ones. Okay. Up here we could see that the background noise started to interfere with the ability to hear and distinguish the supersonic crack, but the muzzle blast was consistent throughout fairly consistent throughout the entire volley. Okay, so In listening to volley 10, you're probably going to pick up more on the muzzle blast, so it's going to sound like boom, 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 rather than tick, 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 tick. But for the first part of it, you can go tick, 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 boom, 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 tick, 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 boom, tick, 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 boom, 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 tick, tick, like that. Except that I didn't have the rate right at the tail end. It would be going bum 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 type thing. You remember that volley? Everybody's listened to that volley. All right, that was volley 10. I don't see anything. I don't see any hits, strikes, or anything else unusual going on. Oh yeah, what's causing this? Once again, I would have to say something related to the camera recording position or direction, or maybe it got shoved close to the clothes and the sounds had to come through the cloth, or something like that. And you can see people talking here, so they're talking about something. Maybe they're talking about moving, and they were starting to shuffle around here. But this is pretty smooth background noise. You see, it's flat. And it's flat there. So then there's some sounds here. So they talked about something. They got the volleys. The camera got positioned in a different way. The volleys stopped, and then there was some shuffling going on. And let's see. Yeah, there was a little bit of increase in sound of the voices. Whereas over here, the voices were more anxiety, shall we say. Yeah, it was talking. That was probably a girl there. And this was probably a guy. And then the guy comes back in, and then the girl comes back in. So it was a couple. And they were talking and making plans, I would say. Okay. That's volley 10. The volley that was sounded like the shooter was running out of gas. Let's move on to the next volley. Volley 11. And so here you start to question whether or not he was getting tired, there was something wrong with the gun, or just what the heck was going on. Volley 11. As you can see, volley 11 really isn't just one volley. It's two close together. But they are separate and distinct in terms of rounds. Alrighty, so what do we notice immediately? Well, once again, we go right up to here. Energy for the muzzles is good and same in both cases. Energy for the supersonic crack is there, but you notice it's not quite as crisp and clear as it was in some of the prior ones. When we come down to the frequency plot, we notice a whole different picture. The volley on the right has not much intensity at all, either for the muzzle or the supersonic crack, and they're a little fuzzier. Over here we can see some pretty good energy for the muzzle, which cuts off right there, and we can see minimal energy for the cracks, supersonic cracks, even though they're all there. We also see that the spacing between them is just like small. I mean, the density here is high compared to over here where the density is much lower. This is a pretty big variation. So that sounds like volley 10, and this sounds these two volleys sound nothing alike. This one's soft, or the camera could be oh, this is a different recording. I forgot to mention that. This is a different recording. The color changed on these bottom points here. So where was this? This is volley 11. Well, there's no lag, or very minimal lag, so it can't be out at the venue. This is probably, and there's not much noise on 11. Let me go back up one. Was that green also? No, okay. So I would say this is the bus stop near Mandalay Bay, because there's not much noise going on otherwise. Okay, what else do we see about this? Well, we can see this kind of chaotic situation portrayed in the amplitude plot also. It would be very hard by just looking at this amplitude plot to pick up on where the muzzles are. If you have to make a first-hand guess, you would say these little variations there are the muzzle, and that the supersonic cracks are the ones at the upper level. Okay, but you really can't make it out much. And then of course you got one shot there that's a big gap. That's volley 11, which really is two bursts, two shorter bursts. The total number of rounds here is, on the order of 50. All right, next volley would be 12, which is the last big volley. Okay. Oh yeah, here we go. This one is definitive. It has the greens, which is the same as the last one, so this is the bus stop. And here you can see the prototypical situation at the bus stop, because you have this big incursion, which is sirens. Okay. And the voices, which are these other little things going on here, are much lower than the muzzle and the supersonic. We have pretty good energy here for the muzzle and pretty good energy for the supersonic. No lag, because you don't get any lag when you're closer to the shooter or at a large oblique angle to the bullet path. This is the last volley. It's short. That as I recall, there's like 44 rounds. You'll see that you have some portions of higher density rounds followed by gradually lower density, meaning the RPM is slowing down. The amplitude here is peaks of that and peaks of the muzzle. Kind of similar to what's going on. Kinda. So what would you hear? These energies aren't quite equal, but they aren't that far apart either. So, and since there's almost no lag, you're going to hear them right on top of one another, which is going to be present as a one sound. It's not going to be strictly the boom boom boom. It's not going to be strictly the tick tick tick. It's going to be a dun 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 dun. It's going to be dun 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 dun, like that. Other than that, there's not much else I can say. So that's the last large volley. That's volley 12. So let's see, the next one is final two shots. Okay, so once again, this is just like looking for the shots in the between volleys 4 and 5. These individual shots are hard to find, but in this case, since the background is quiet enough, they're not so hard to find. And we just go through it quickly. You can see here that, if I get my act together. Now in this case, we can immediately point out the peaks because they're pretty prominent and spiky. But we can also point out that there's something here. Don't know what it is. Something probably right there. Maybe something there. That's the same as above. So we can clearly identify two supersonic cracks with a maybe low intensity muzzle retort, but this could also be reflections, and it's hard to say. I'll have to do a little bit closer examination to tell you what these are. So at first blush, we'll just leave it as two sounds, one here and one there, because the other things could be echoes, they could be muzzle retorts. So you have to go into much greater detail, and that confirms with what I said earlier, is that these single shots are hard to deal with because there's not a lot of cooperation around them. And what was this, 10 seconds? Yeah. So that's the last two shots, and I think that's the end of the show. Yeah. Oh, there's volley 8. Now I find it. Oh, one more before we go. Okay, volley 8. Volley 8 consists of 2 bursts separated by a small region. The energy associated with the muzzle is pretty good but variable. The energy associated with the supersonic cracks is pretty good but variable. On the energy plot, there is lag steps here and there, here, here, and here. So this is, once again, since it's the gray, first off, we'll notice that the marked muzzle blacks regions are really uniform. So this is one of those rounds, one of those volleys that could be mistaken for an automatic gun. The energy here on the frequency of the muzzles is pretty consistent, but wanes a little here for the first burst. For the second burst, it's pretty darn weak. For the second burst, the supersonic cracks are louder than the muzzle and pretty good. And for the first burst, there's some variation, and it's softer than the muzzle. So 2 different combinations. In the first one, you hear the muzzles more than you hear the cracks. In the second one, you hear the cracks more than the muzzle. And that tells you that the orientation of the gun changed between these 2 bursts. In fact, it may be, well, it's pretty consistent there. You'll see also something happened with 2 rounds there. That those could have been strikes, or it could have been a momentary closing the distance between. There could be a couple of strikes there also. And there could be some small things going on there. It's hard to say. Okay, so volley 8 is one of the more consistent ones. In this recording location, it has pretty big lag. The second burst is not quite as distinct as the first, but overall they're pretty consistent in terms of both energy, frequency, and cadence. Okay. So I did have volley 8, it's just out of order. Alright, well, I hope this has been informative. Like I said, no math, no calculations, just qualitative analysis on a large macro scale for the structure of all the volleys in the individual rounds. Alright, we'll catch you in the next one. Have a good evening.